Take 5. 5 questions to authors and artists. With a common question, we get a personal perspective on what shapes their views. Now poet, traveller and author Karen Connelly. Is there a book that inspired you to write?
Probably one of the most important books that I read when I was a teenager is a little tiny, slender book by an American naturalist writer named Annie Dillard. And the book is called Holy the Firm. Holy the Firm, I think, is a Catholic reference to the truth in a way. And this book, Holy the Firm, is an extremely poetic, beautiful exploration of suffering and violence and how or if God could exist in a world where there is so much suffering and violence. And at that time, I think I was 14 when I read it, 14 or 15. At that time, I was extricating myself from a fundamentalist religion, from the religion that I was raised in as a child. And so that book was a real key for me to open up a different way of thinking about human life and what suffering in human life is.
So did this kind of almost unpacking of your religious beliefs create a sort of creative flow and give you the idea that writing was an option?
I was already a writer. I started writing when I learned to write. I was desperate to figure out language as a very small child. But Holy the Firm was special in that it captured all of the things that I was struggling with personally at that moment, in a way that used some of the mythology that I had grown up on, right? So she talks about Jesus and she talks about the kind of Christian God that I was familiar with, but she took those ideas of God and Christ and what they do for humans or don't do for humans, and she just kind of broke it open in a very, very direct, vivid, gorgeous way. The language in that book is very beautiful, very, very rich. And it's about a woman who is a writer, who is in an isolated community on the west coast of the United States, beautiful island, and she herself is thinking about all of these things. Mm-hmm. And it's very, very integrated in a way. So it's a book that thinks about human suffering, but it also thinks about suffering and violence in the animal world. And it makes it part of life rather than something to escape.
So was this like your road to Damascus? Did you suddenly almost convert from being
I did, in a way,
to
something, to something much more open and much more questioning. The one truth, I was raised as a Jehovah's Witness. So the one truth, the Jehovah's Witnesses, that's one of their expressions, is that you're raised in the truth and you live in the truth. And I realized how untruthful that expression was for that group of people, because it is so, it's like any orthodox or fundamentalist religion or cult-like organization. They really do believe that they have the one truth. Mm. And from a very young age, that obviously, with my mind and my intellect and my spirit, that was not really going to be a possibility for me to continue living that way. So that book, Holy the Firm, it was using Christian mythology in a way that I recognized and understood because I knew the Bible very well. But it did something different with it that was like enabled me to break through in a spiritual way as well as an intellectual way.
I feel in the introduction I didn't really give you proper due, like it's not really very clear to our listeners that as well as being a fictional writer, you're also a non-fiction writer and a poet.
I am.
And I was just wondering, like, you know, because obviously you said you learnt to write early age, and like with the writing came, like, you really wanted to be expressing things early. And is that something like poetry? Because, you know, as a kid, sometimes you are taught that you have to do a poem about your cat or whatever it is, and then you just stop almost. You don't think of poetry.
You stop writing poetry.
Yeah. And I was wondering if you had some continuity in that, or if you could just tell us a little about your poetry writings.
Yeah, there was a continuity, and in fact, that was also a key book for that, because it is so poetic. The prose in that book, and in much of her other early work, is very, very... it just uses language in a deeply metaphorical way. So one of the ways that she writes in Wholly the Firm, Teaching a Stone to Talk, is a collection of her essays. Famous book that she won a couple of big American prizes for when she was really young, early or mid-20s, is called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. Also the same kinds of explorations, though Pilgrim at Tinker Creek really examines the natural world. But again, through a lens of believing in a Christian God, but a Christian God unlike the one that I was raised with. And her language is poetry. So for me, she was an important writer in the sense that she gave me a way to start thinking prosaically, to start thinking about language and prose, because I wrote a lot of poetry when I was a child and continued as a young teenager. You know, I was one of those teenagers who, after the crappy poetry assignments at school ended, which of course I always liked, I went to the school library and looked up the poets, you know, Canadian poets, English poets, poets in translation. And that's when I was really young. I was like 13, 14, 15 doing that. So poetry, partly because of the Bible is also a profoundly poetic collection of histories, right? I was very, very attracted to kind of mythic language that relies on rhythm and kind of moral authority, or at least an exploration of morality. And Jesus, of course, was big into that. Yeah. So I had
Rumor
this.
Has it.
So I had this early kind of education in a very poetic prose, but again, Annie Dillard was a way for me to open up into something that was much more contemporary and much more open to the world, right? Lots of possibilities. And
interesting. I must admit, I don't know any of her work. I'm definitely going to start looking her up. Is it a foolish question, because I'm wondering if it'll be the same, to ask you, is there a book you wish you'd written? Like, would it be that one, or...
Oh, I think I wish I'd written, you know, probably some of the Bible. I wish I'd written the Song of Solomon, you know, and nobody really knows who wrote the Song of Solomon. It's some people believe it was a woman, and it's a very gorgeous book of poetry, really, or Proverbs or the Psalms. I mean, I still occasionally read to my absolutely flabbergasted and stunned students passages from the Bible, just to remind them how, because most of them haven't read it, of course, just to remind them, to show them what a beautiful book it is, you know, how strong that language is. There is a reason why it's a bestseller, continues to be a bestseller. So yeah, no single person could write the entire Bible, but sure, I could choose a book. The Song of Solomon or the Proverbs or the Psalms.
Yeah, they are very beautiful. Is there anything that you feel doesn't belong between the covers of a book? Any content or...
No, absolutely not. Everything belongs in books. Everything is already in books. So there's no way to stop more from getting in there. And I'm working on a book right now that sometimes I reread passages that I've written and I just think, oh my God, what am I doing? I'm destroying a perfectly viable literary reputation with this book. Or I'm writing something that is true and vital for me profound and also extremely funny. It's entirely about relationships, sex, housework, and child rearing, but it's especially about sex. And so I'm trying to be honest about sex, but also be intelligent, funny, and literary about it. So it's not easy, but it certainly is fun trying.
I'm there. I love the fact that you're questioning whether it belongs between the covers of a book. You know, it's when you're talking about destroying a literary reputation, it's kind of like, wow, what's in that? Is there any chance you'll read us an extract?
I could. I would have to run upstairs and
we'd love
get
that.
it. Yeah, I'd have to get a piece.
Thank you. Okay, so very quickly, let's run to the next 2 questions because I'm really keen on the extract. Is there a book that you would like read to you? On the basis that it's a really nice voice. A voice you like.
Oh, I think there's so many books like that.
Why?
Well, if you start thinking about poetry collections, you know, the collected poetry of Stephen Dunn. He's an American poet that I really like. And it's a big, thick book, easily. It's his first, I'm thinking of the first collected works of Stephen Dunn. And that would be wonderful to just sit somewhere by a fire outside and have somebody read me Stephen Dunn's poetry. Shakespeare, to listen to the sonnets of Shakespeare, well read. Lots of things. I think we love being read to. If the reader is gifted, if the reader is a good reader and has a beautiful voice, it's a wonderful thing.
I totally understand why you chose poetry, because to be honest, poetry didn't make as much sense to me until I heard it out loud. I found it quite difficult to kind of get there, and suddenly you hear it and it all makes sense.
Well, there's so much that the rhythm explains to you. So it doesn't matter if you don't really, I mean, it's very difficult to remember poetry if you're sitting there sort of in the sea of the words. But when you're in that sea, it's an extremely beautiful place to move in, you know, to just feel, and just it's such an experience of language and sound to hear poetry read. Rudyard Kipling. I grew up on Rudyard Kipling, the poems of Rudyard Kipling, and you know, his really great poems, but many of them are not very well known. But the ones that I loved when I was a kid, like Adamzad the Bear and The Old Men and the great white horses. I mean, some of them are amazing poems. I still love them.
Yeah, I'm from the subcontinent where, you know, because he was racist and blah blah blah, I still love his work.
Oh no, I know all about the Orientalism and everything, but it doesn't really make any difference to me.
Doesn't impact on me either. Finally, if there was no print, no books, way long ago, would you have been a storyteller?
I think I would have been a singer, actually. I probably would have been a singer. I may have been a storyteller, but, you know, there wasn't a long, if we're talking a long time ago, there was not really such a separation then as now between the storyteller and the song, the minstrel. And even pre-minstrel times, you know, earlier than that. One of the ways of remembering the stories was to sing them. One of the ways of holding all of that information and all of those linkages between, you know, one generation and another was to sing them. The rhythm held the story. So I often think, and people ask me if I'm a singer sometimes when I read, and I think that if it was that long ago, I would probably be a singer somehow.
And why not now? Like, why aren't you tempted to be singing now?
Because the impulse to write is too strong, and I love to sing, but I'm not particularly talented musically. Like, I don't play an instrument. I used to play a couple of different instruments, but my work as a writer has kind of overtaken my sort of interest in music, at least in the sense of performing it or making some kind of livelihood from it, or having it fill my life the way that language does. And that's probably a lack in a way. That's probably a loss that, you know, maybe maybe when I'm older and I have more time, maybe I'll try and correct that. We'll see. I don't know.
I look forward to finding out.
So this is an excerpt from a new novel that I've been working on, and it should be finished in the next couple of months. It's a departure for me in terms of material. It is called The Change Room, and it's the story of Eliza Churchill, who is a flower designer. She's kind of a haute couture florist who works with a few different people. And she is the mother of 2 young children, happily married to a man who's a math prof at a local university. And she's an extremely busy person. Typical, high-charged, small businesswoman who has a million things going on at the same time, lists to do everywhere, and no time. There's no time in her life. The only thing that she kind of does for herself is she goes swimming twice a week in the morning at the local pool up the street. And one day when she is rushing off to go swimming, and, you know, gets ready at the pool, she meets a woman in the change room of this local pool where she goes. And with this meeting, her life changes dramatically. Not immediately, but soon thereafter, soon after this meeting. So I'm going to read you this meeting between Eliza and a woman who she initially calls the Amazon. Eliza was in the middle of these bodies, a fairly fit, shapely body, medium-sized breasts, the rounded, slightly stretched-out belly of a woman with kids. She was not quite voluptuous, not anymore. Muscular thighs from years of cycling, though now with the kids, she hadn't made any long overnight rides in years. She rode her bike around the city, though, in the park sometimes, down to the lake when she had a moment. She hadn't put it away until the end of December this year. She was still strong, and the swimming made her body smoother somehow, stretched away some of the extra flesh. She thought of herself as slightly above average when it came to being in shape. But really she was no different than most of the women who came here to swim in the mornings. Every once in a while, one of these almost girls appeared, like this one, a woman as young as they had once been, supple and flat-bellied and ripe with their own beauty. Fertility, essentially, as Andrew, her husband, used to say of such women when the 2 of them were younger. Eminently fuckable. She glanced away, opened her shampoo bottle. She is, of course, looking at this woman. She's in the shower room of the swimming pool. It was lovely to look at such a body, but not nice to stare. The Amazon stood up and lifted the long-bladed shins into the spray. She was finished, but she stayed on under the hot water, rubbing the last of the soap off herself, rubbing herself. Their eyes met briefly, and briefly they smiled. Eliza said the words to herself in her mind, "What am I doing?" She squeezed inwardly and felt a tug at the root of her clitoris. She felt so wet, but then she was taking a shower. That's what happened anyway with ovulation. It was biological. She suddenly understood why she loved the pool. She squeezed some conditioner into her hand and massaged it into her scalp. Other people had sex once a week. She had the pool. Twice. These bodies, hers and hers and hers, the occasional his. Some men swam too, but it was the women she saw, mirrors of herself, naked and clothed in flushed skin. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had sex with her husband. More than a month ago? More like 6 weeks. Surely the current dry spell couldn't have been more than 2 months? Please God. That was life with 2 small children, night wakers both. It was nothing to be ashamed about, sexlessness. And I am not ashamed, she thought. I am just wildly horny. She wanted to be fucked upside down and sideways, from the front, from the back, from the top and bottom, fucked and fucked and fucked and fucked. Well, of course, she was ovulating. The survival of the race had once depended upon fucking. No longer, of course. In fact, the opposite was true now. The last thing the race and the planet needed were more rapacious fucking humans. But she was trying to plug her horniness into evolutionary theory. The last of the eggs were falling through her body. Soon there would be no more. And she had never felt so lustful in her life. The Amazon spoke in a surprisingly loud voice. That was fun. Sorry? She had heard her or deciphered the loud, echoey words, but she had water in one of her ears. She felt her face turning red. Knowing she was blushing made her blush again. It was fun to race you there, in the pool. You beat me, Eliza smiled. To the tall woman, and her smile changed into something else, a big, white-toothed, wolfish grin. I did beat you. I was happy about that. I like winning. Eliza was so confused by the sexual purr of the woman's voice that she couldn't respond. Was she just imagining it, the come-on, the forwardness of the tone? Who talked like that? No one she knew. She managed a few rote phrases. Well done. Congratulations. I would love to swim more, get in shape. But you're in beautiful shape. Okay, so maybe some people did talk like that. The woman grinned at her with an unmistakable directness and flicked her eyes downward, then back up to Eliza's face. Eliza, embarrassed, closed her eyes and put her head back into the water so that the Amazon couldn't look at her. But of course she was looking at her, and Eliza knew that. She had invited the Amazon's eyes by closing her own. That's when the swimmers really looked at each other, in the shower when their heads were back, eyes closed, soap running down their backs. But this was different. She knew it, felt it. The air was full of sexual electricity, that live current running through the air between them. She smiled at the thought that sparked into her mind. We could get electrocuted, all this water around us. She was always telling the boys to be careful of electrical cords near water. At least no one could hear her heart pounding, not even herself. She felt it like an engine in her chest, her throat, thumping in her water drum ears. It has come to this, she thought, flirting with hot young women at the pool. Andrew has to fuck me. Not that she had flirted, but had she just been flirted with? Wasn't that flirtation? Or was it? When was the last time she had flirted anyway? She had no idea. She was too busy to flirt.
Oh, how fantastic. Thank you. I just so want to hear more, because obviously the beginning of an affair is always charged. And you just,
it's quite fun.
Yeah, I bet that's fun to write as well. Karen Connelly, thank you so much.
You are very welcome. It's been a pleasure.